Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor von Robert, the director of this wonderful Taube Center for Jewish Studies and faculty in religious studies, and I know most of you anyhow. I just said to Barry that at Stanford you never know, because anything that's before World War II and has nothing to do with technology, you don't know whether people are interested. So I'm very excited that you all came to hear about Talmud as icon. And I'll briefly introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Barry Wimpfheimer. Although some of you may know him and do know him, and also the newest book that we'll hear about. So Barry is associate professor at Northwestern. I think courtesy appointment also in the law department. And is award-winning for various of his writings. The dissertation in 2005 got the Baron Prize. A few years later, he published that in a much revised and beautiful book version as narrating the law, a poetics of Talmudic legal stories, on reading Agadah and Halacha, or the narrative material in the Talmud and the legal material together, and the necessity of doing that because they mutually illuminate each other. And then in between, he also edited a book for a friend of his who passed away early. At a congregational member at Emek Bracha. Also a beautiful collection of essays in memory of Dr. Beth Samuels called Wisdom of Batsheva, with a number of people in our community who contributed. And the most recent book that came out, about which we will hear tonight, is the Talmud, a Biography. When you Google around a little bit, you'll see that the book was also written up in the book section of the Chicago Tribune. Not many of us get for academic books right up in the larger fake news out there. So that is very exciting. But it got it got a lot of attention. It's a beautiful volume in the the Lives of Great Books series at Princeton University Press. So the Talmud made it in there, as of course it should. And most recently, the book was awarded the National Jewish Book Award for the category of education and Jewish identity. And I wanted to sort of say, here's the various things that we have in common. Barry is the director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern. I'm the director here. We're both in Talmud. He also has a connection with Talmud because he has an online course, which he says is still there, through Coursera. And there's not so many online courses, mass MOOC courses on Talmud and Rabbinic, so that's something to explore. But Barry is also a very energetic young scholar, a rising star has been for a while now on the horizon of rabbinics in academia. So I'm very excited to welcome you to our community, and I give you the podium.
Thank you, Professor von Robert, for your introduction. Also, thank you for inviting me. It was Professor von Robert who reached out to me even before the book came out and told me that she wanted me to come out here. So I'm glad that I got to do this, and I'm happy to see some familiar faces. So Serena Eisenberg, who some of you may know, was in my Wexner Fellowship class. We were class 9. They're now up to class 26. And so we haven't seen each other in a really long time, but it's nice to see some familiar old faces. In a previous lifetime, it certainly feels like a previous lifetime to me, I was an aspiring rabbi, and during that lifetime I spent 2 summers serving as a rabbi in Santa Barbara, California. And on both of those summers, I was able to take trips up north here to Palo Alto. I had some friends who were in school here and living here. And I always felt very at home in this community. Professor von Robert also mentioned my friend, my late friend Beth Samuels, and the volume that I put out in her memory. So I feel like I have a very strong connection with this area. I'm really happy to come out here. Before I begin with a somewhat more formal presentation, I want to just say a little bit about myself and what qualifies me to write a book called The Talmud, a biography. And one of the cool features of this book that I love is that if you take the jacket cover off, it just says Wimpfheimer, the Talmud, which makes it seem as though I wrote the Talmud, which is just like what a wonderful thing that you get to. And in the Jewish tradition, where I think Daniel Boyarin said this to me, in the Jewish tradition where we call people by the names of their most prominent books, maybe I'll be known as the Talmud from here on in. So these are wonderful things. When I was 17, I left my childhood home in New York and went to yeshiva in Israel to study in yeshiva for what I thought was going to be a year. After 6 months of yeshiva in Israel, I was sick and tired of Talmud. I had been studying Talmud since I was about 10 years old. I knew how to read the text. I knew how to make sense of it, but I didn't see the point. And then at some point, 6 months into my studies, I encountered a teacher who finally taught me advanced Talmud in a way that made it so intellectually and emotionally satisfying and so religiously meaningful that I've basically spent my life since then has been devoted. It's now been 27 and a half years, and I've basically been devoted to the Talmud ever since. My relationship to the Talmud has changed over time. My religious practices and commitments have changed over time. But the one thing that has been constant is that I really enjoy studying Talmud. I enjoy teaching Talmud. And what I was trying to do in writing this book was to try to distill some of the things that I've learned by studying the Talmud at an advanced level in a lot of different contexts for readers of all levels. I think the book can be absorbed by readers of all levels in different ways. I tried to write for multiple audiences at the same time. Readers who've studied the Talmud their whole lives, I think, will find that there's a lot of material and information in here that is news to them. It's particularly because we academics, and there are only a few of us in the world, we tend to write for ourselves and for our little in-group, and we don't generally translate that for a larger audience. And meanwhile, people who've never studied Talmud before, for whom the word Talmud is just intimidating, will find that the book is a nice introduction that will give you like a concrete base of, okay, now I understand what this thing is, and importantly, why it has mattered in the history of Judaism. So without further ado, I will now go into my more formal talks, and I'm going to open with something that's pretty current, though probably what I do with it will be a little less satisfying than you would expect. A few weeks ago, in a New York Times interview, the writer Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple, listed among her current reading list an overtly anti-Semitic book. Publication of the interview led to widespread condemnation of this book. Tablet magazine ran a whole expose, and of Walker's own anti-Semitism. Exhibit A for Walker's anti-Semitism is a poem she wrote in 2017 entitled, "It is Our Frightful Duty to Study the Talmud." Much of the Jewish media has referred to this poem as anti-Semitic propaganda, the trucks in various forms of very old conspiracy theories and lies. And they're right. That's actually what the poem is. But because of my own interests, I'm a very peculiar person, I'm drawn to a very small aspect of this episode. Why does Alice Walker use the Talmud to express her political views? And I'm going to begin to answer this question by going back 8 centuries to the 13th century. So we're going to be jumping a lot through time in this talk. My book covers from essentially 2nd century BCE all the way to the present, and my talk is going to do something like that as well. In 1240, a Franciscan friar named Nicholas Donin, who had recently converted from Judaism to Christianity, wrote an indictment that raised 35 formal charges against the Talmud. These charges included a variety of alleged heresies, but the ones that resonated with Pope Gregory IX, the recipient of Donin's letter, were the ones that asserted that the Babylonian Talmud was an anti-Christian work. Pope Gregory IX responded to Donin's indictment by encouraging Christian political authorities in Western Europe to seize the handwritten manuscripts of the Talmud from which 13th century Jews would study and to destroy them. King Louis IX of France was the only ruler who put Gregory's recommendation into effect. People were sent into Jewish homes on the Sabbath. Manuscripts of the Talmud were seized, collected, and brought under the control of Dominicans and Franciscans. Louis IX then convened a tribunal to hear what was formally termed a disputation between Donin and other Franciscans on the one side, and a number of Jewish rabbis, including a prominent Tosafist, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, on the other. Though it was formally labeled a disputation, which is kind of a debate, this was not a debate, not a balanced debate in which each side is free to express itself as it would. We know of what transpired during the disputation from the Latin and Hebrew accounts that were produced by the respective sides. After a few days of speeches from the respective sides, in the presence of people including the Queen Mother, Queen Blanche of Castile, the tribunal decided that the Talmud was indeed a heretical work and needed to be suppressed. Between 20 and 24 cartloads of the collected handwritten Talmud manuscripts were burned in the Place de Grève, the site of high-profile Parisian executions. For some time now, scholars have referred to this episode, the Paris disputation, as a trial in which the Talmud was the defendant. In my view, not enough attention has been paid to the strangeness of this fact, that the Talmud, a work of literature, was indicted, tried, convicted, and executed. In short, the Talmud was personified and then punished. How should we understand this strange episode in the history of world literature? I believe that a deeper understanding of the 13th century cultural context will shed light on the symbolic register of this episode. We'll explain why the trial and execution of a book did not seem so out of place at the time. The culture of Ashkenaz, the Jewish term for the medieval communities that Jews founded in Northern Europe, France, Germany, and a little bit in England, can be characterized by a combination of Jewish and Christian physical proximity and a concomitant profound animosity. The villages in this part of the world were often contained within the space of a modern urban square block. They're probably not bigger than the quads that I walked through on the way here. But both the Jews and the Christians, who at times intimately cared for one another, had a visceral antipathy for one another, particularly one another's ideas. Now, I'm using the term visceral on purpose. Carol Walker Bynum, the distinguished medieval scholar of Christianity, has demonstrated the ways in which Christian religious practice was being transformed in the 13th century in the direction of viscera. Cults emerged around physical relics, like relics of pieces of the saints' bodies, that proved so appealing to the populace at large that they could not be contained by church authorities. The church authorities would try to suppress these cults and the worship of them, but they couldn't do enough about them. Consider also the simultaneous rise of the ascetic Franciscan order and its parallel in Jewish context, the Hasidei Ashkenaz, a Jewish ascetic subgroup. Both of these groups famously wounded themselves in new and creative ways in order to transcend the body. So here I have a picture of what someone would do to wound themselves, to take metal to the body. This turn to the physical is also evident in the anti-Semitic recurring charges that were leveled for the first time in the 13th century. 3 different types of charges: accusations of host desecration, ritual murder, and the blood libel, began to be employed regularly against Jews and led to executions of individuals or expulsions of whole communities. Now, if we unpack the 3 recurring charges that were commonly leveled, we can see something important about the religious symbolics of the day. Host desecration is a charge that Jews need to steal the host wafer from churches and reenact the passion of the killing of Jesus by desecrating his body embodied in the wafer. Ritual murder was a charge that Jews needed to kill a Christian in order to ritually reenact the murder of Jesus. And the blood libel asserted that Jews needed the blood of a Christian in order to produce matzah for Passover. All 3 of these charges were Christian counter-ritual accusations. In other words, in each case, the Christians imagined a Judaism that worked along the lines of 13th century Christianity in the direction of viscera and symbolic personification. To people who took the embodiment of Christ in the wafer very seriously, it made perfect sense that Judaism would require a similar ritual in which adherents would have to defile the wafer. The blood libel similarly made sense because the imagined requirement of visceral blood made sense within a 13th century Christian milieu. I'd like to suggest that we understand the symbolic meaning of the burning of the Talmud in light of these cultural realities. The burning of the Talmud is the inverse of these charges. The Jewish text is personified and then is ritually murdered as a symbol of Judaism and contemporary Jews. This symbolic understanding is enhanced by the realization that unlike the heavily iconic medieval Christianity, which had icons everywhere, medieval Ashkenazic Judaism was rigidly symbol-free. Now, Judaism is, according to the Ten Commandments, antagonistic to images. But throughout Jewish history, the level of Jewish aniconism, and you could talk to Ariel Mays maybe about Kabbalah and its relationship with images. Throughout Jewish history, there's been a somewhat fluid relationship between Judaism and images. Medieval Ashkenaz, though, is a community that took aniconism very seriously. They didn't have visual symbols. The Talmud, on the other hand, was a work that this community in particular invested in quite heavily, more so than any contemporaneous Jewish culture. The burning of the Talmud was an extremely effective destruction of a Jewish symbol. It was effectively a passion story in reverse. I opened my talk with a 13th century example because it is the first of many episodes in Jewish history in which the Talmud functions as an icon of Judaism, Jewishness, or the Jews. In my recently published biography of the Talmud, which you see here, I developed the idea that there are three different registers that exist when we speak of the Talmud. I label these registers the essential, the enhanced, and the emblematic. The Talmud, and now I'll detail what these are. The Talmud is a book, a work of literature produced in a specific time and place and confined to the meaning that emerges from its words. For those of you who don't know, the Talmud is the culmination of a movement known as Rabbinic Judaism, which over a 700-year period, beginning with the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, reimagined Judaism for a diasporic existence that didn't have a temple. While before the destruction of the temple, the cult of Judaism consisted almost entirely of temple-based sacrificial rites, after the rabbinic period, Judaism becomes a text-focused, comprehensive religious ideology with a demanding and rigorous set of mandated behaviors that have nothing to do with sacrificial rites. The Talmud reads like a rabbinic conversation that lasts several centuries, with later rabbis interpreting and debating the ideas of their predecessors. Their debates include many layers of nuanced interpretation and many original theological or legal ideas, along with a large collection of stories about the rabbis. The Talmud is famous for the ways in which the rabbis brazenly usurp the religious authority of God. There's the famous episode of the Oven of Achnai, where the rabbis say, we don't care what God says, we're going to take, the majority is going to decide. They tolerate the possibility of true religious and legal pluralism. They have multiple opinions. In every rabbinic text, there are multiple ideas of what's right, and resist the impulse to resolve open debates. So the Talmud famously doesn't resolve its conversations. It leaves things open-ended. When we speak of the Talmud's meaning, we often reference the essential meaning of the Talmud, by which I mean the meaning of the Talmud as a book. The original historical meaning of the Talmud when it was produced as a book. Beyond its meaning as a book, though, the Talmud is significant. The Talmud is significant because it has implicated an almost unparalleled discourse of reception. The Talmud has stood at the center of elite Jewish ideological conversations for a millennium. That's a long time. During that time, many different literatures of reception, so responsa, law codes, commentaries, homilies, even mystical tracts, can be thought of as literatures of reception of the Talmud, and they've expanded the meaning of the Talmud in all kinds of ways within the Jewish tradition. When traditional Jews invoke the Talmud, or when the Talmud is studied in traditional yeshivas, it is often this discourse, including the entire literature of reception, that people are invoking when they mention the Talmud or its study. The third register is one so the terms the essential and the enhanced, I am inventing these terms and I'm using them to describe these things, but before I wrote the book that was kind of recognized. One of the major interventions of my book is the introduction of this third category, the emblematic, which is what tonight's talk is really about. The symbolic register, this emblematic register, is interrelated with the Talmud's meaning as both book and discourse. I'm not under an illusion that the symbolic aspects of the Talmud are not related to its internal content. It was, after all, the anti-Christian content of the book that drew the ire of Nicholas Donin and Pope Gregory IX. The discourse is also very present. One of the Tosafists, and the Tosafists are one of the leading practitioners of the enhanced Talmud. The discourse is present within the Jewish defense of the Talmud, where other texts are invoked. But in my opinion, the most significant meaning of the Talmud's trial in the 13th century is the symbolism of the Talmud's trial, its conviction, and its execution. Now, in my ensuing remarks, I will remove rapidly from the 13th century to the present and make an argument about the iconization of the Talmud. The story I'm about to tell is the story of how the Talmud acquired a fixed and rigid body, and how that body is becoming increasingly a religious icon and inspiring new modes of religious interaction. I'll start the story back in the 1st century at the dawn of the rabbinic movement. The rabbis produced all of their literature orally. This fact is undisputed, but shocking. Rabbinic literature includes many different works, the Talmud being the largest and most impressive. The Talmud dwarfs the Bible in size. If you don't know the Talmud, even if you took out all the commentaries, the Talmud is probably 3 times the size of the Bible. The rabbis operated within a culture that was relatively literate and regularly produced the Hebrew Bible as a written canon on parchment scrolls. So despite the availability of writing as a technology, the rabbis did not avail themselves of the scroll or the book. Rather, they pridefully described their own literature as the oral Torah and insisted that it remain untranscribed. The Talmud would circulate and be studied orally until the 9th century, when some began to write it down. We know this. We know they began to write it down in the 9th century because we have a 9th century text in which a scholar badmouths another school, a neighboring school, because in that neighboring school they've started to study the Talmud from a written text, which isn't the real way you study Talmud. The real way you study Talmud is, of course, orally. Some of the early transcriptions of the Talmud were produced on parchment scrolls similar to the ones on which Jews from antiquity to the present have written their Torah. But by the 9th century, the more popular and better technology was the codex, a bound paper book that was designed for scribal handwriting. So it's like a diary, a bound book that you write in. From the 9th to the 15th centuries, the Talmud was copied in part or whole by professional scribes and non-professional learners alike all over the Jewish world. As with any ancient text that survived the vicissitudes of transcription, the Talmud has some degree of variance between and among its different manuscripts. Medieval commentaries, like Rashi or Nachmanides, were hyper-aware of this variance and often employed a real or hypothetical variant as a means of resolving a logical or conceptual shortcoming in the text. Rashi will routinely say, in my version of the text reads differently, and this is what it says. With the dawn of print in the 15th century, the Talmud began to be printed. The earliest printings were of popular individual tractates in the 15th century, in Spain, in Portugal, and in Fez, Morocco. The expulsion of the Jews from Iberia in 1492 and 1497 shifted the locus of Jewish printing to Italy, where the Sansino family, made famous by the translations that borrow their name, the Sansino family of printers, published some of the important first editions in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Between 1520 and 1523, Daniel Bomberg, a Christian printer originally from Antwerp, Belgium, produced a deluxe and complete edition of the Babylonian Talmud. Incidentally, someone reached out to me last week and started suggesting that we need to start planning conferences in honor of the 500-year anniversary of the printing. It's not a terrible idea. Maybe we'll come in Stanford. Maybe we'll have a conference here. This edition established the pagination of the Talmud. Forever after, references to the Talmud include citation to a page number and a folio. So you'll get page 33, side A or side B. Now, if you trace the development of the printing of the Talmud from the 1520s to the 1820s, you discover some not so surprising facts: that the Talmud was printed fairly often, and that each new edition attempts to add features that improve upon prior editions. It's actually a fantastic marketing study, if anyone wants to do this. These features are aesthetic, better paper, better fonts, cleaner lines; intellectual, newer commentaries; or practical, new layouts, new apparati for cross-referencing. By the time you get to the Amsterdam edition of the Purps Press in the late 18th century, so in the 1780s, you find most of the features of the Talmud editions employed today. At the end of the 19th century, one edition published in the 1880s came to not just dominate, but to somewhat monopolize the market. The Vilna Shas of the 1880s, the page image that is probably familiar to any of you who've studied Talmud in the past, was produced by the Widow and Brothers Ram Press and drew upon two earlier 19th century Ram Talmuds. So this house had produced two earlier ones. The 1820s Ram Talmud, which by today's standards actually plagiarized a rival edition from the Slavuta press, introduces a beautiful new central font that moves Hebrew from the calligraphic look of Torah writing into a modern print era. So people who are teachers of Hebrew or students of Hebrew, the Vilna Font, so I'm 45. When I was growing up, all of the primers that taught you how to read Hebrew used the Vilna Font as the basic lettering that you taught children. That was the basic lettering, but that was invented in the 1820s by the Vilna Press for their edition of Talmud. It was one of their big 1820s innovations. The 1850s Ram Talmud just reproduces the look of the 1820s one without much change. But in the 1880s Ram Talmud, they made a few changes. One of the major changes is that they added a third tier of commentary consistently. So every page of the Ram Talmud has this new layer of commentary. Some earlier editions had occasionally made use of that space, but in the Ram Talmud, they make use of that space on every page. And they had to find medieval commentaries for every page of the Talmud that were not known so that they could put something on those pages. Now, they had access to a new type of technology in the 1880s. It was called Stereotype Technology. And it allowed you to produce, to take movable type, to turn it into rubber, and then from the rubber to create a single metal sheet made out of lead that you would use to run off your printings. This stereotype would have enabled the Ram to compete with other presses on price. But Ram chose to create something of a luxury Talmud. So we're pretty close to Cupertino, so Apple is an interesting model here. They instead of competing on price and making a cheaper Talmud, they made a much more expensive one. They produced a more impressive work, but one that cost as much as 5 times what rival presses charged. The strategy, surprisingly, was effective. Publication of the Ram Shas put several competing Talmud printers out of business, and the stereotyping technologies allowed Ram to print the work almost on demand, which they weren't able to do before. Where the 1820s and 1850s editions had sold out, now the Ram could print new copies whenever the stock was low. This ensured that the Ram Shas was always available. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Ram still had competitors, but was recognized as the deluxe edition, and therefore the one people aspired to purchase if they could afford it, when they bought a complete set. World War I further augmented this monopoly. The occupation of Vilnius, Lithuania, led to rumors that the Ram press had been destroyed. This encouraged American and British printers, who had now new technology, photo offset technology, to reproduce the Ram edition in both London and New York without paying the copyright holders. Though the Ram press would emerge after the war and reassert its copyright, some of the damage was already done. But what was bad for the business, for Ram, was really good for the rise of the Ram edition as the default edition of the Talmud in the late 19th and early 20th century. When after World War II, the US Army decided to repurpose a Nazi printing house and paper and print an edition of the Talmud, the Survivor's Talmud, they employed photo offset technology to reproduce the Ram edition. And this is how, by the end of World War II, the Ram edition had become the Talmud's modern body. A work that had once been oral and had survived a half-millennium of handwritten transcription and variants, that had been printed in over 100 editions, was now associated with a single print edition. It's kind of shocking, actually. The full ramifications of Ram's monopoly would materialize in the context of 2 translation projects in the second half of the 20th century. So beginning in the late 1960s, the prominent public intellectual Adin Steinsaltz began to produce an Israeli edition of the Talmud that vocalized the text. You see there are dots in here. And offered a paraphrastic translation. So this is his translation of the Talmud into modern Hebrew. From the ancient, the Talmud is written in a hybrid of ancient Aramaic and Hebrew, and so he translated it into modern Hebrew. The Steinsaltz edition also incorporated some scientific data, particularly about flora and fauna, where appropriate. Now, the Steinsaltz edition maintained the general look of a Talmud page. It has central text with commentaries all around, but it did not adhere to the pagination established by the 16th century Bamberg edition. It replaced Rashi. Rashi usually occupies the inside spot, and in the Steinsaltz edition, Rashi gets moved to the outside spot to make space for the paraphrased translation. Also, while the Vilna edition uses the Rashi typeface for all commentary, except for Rabbeinu Hananel on that third tier, they use a different one, but it generally used one Rashi font for commentary. The Steinsaltz replaces, it only puts Rashi in the Rashi typeface, and everyone else gets put in this modern Israeli type called Frank Rule. And the Tosafists get moved down. There's a lot of movement going on this page. The Steinsaltz edition was popular with Israeli non-religious learners, and in the United States with those non-Orthodox Jews who studied the Talmud, primarily in rabbinical schools. It was decidedly unpopular with Orthodox Jews in both the United States and in Israel, and it developed a particularly harsh response from the ultra-Orthodox. For the ultra-Orthodox, Steinsaltz's edition was seen as an assault on a tradition embodied by the Vilna Shas. Whether the objection was phrased as a problem with Steinsaltz's placement of his own translation in the place of Rashi, or the newfangled pagination, in retrospect, this was a debate about the Talmud as a symbol. And some of the issue had to do with the problem of transforming the Talmud's visual image. For traditional Jews, the Talmud had come to have one physical form, the Vilna Shas, and any attempt to alter that form, however much it would be an improvement, was an offense to tradition. In the early 1990s, the Art Scroll Press, an ultra-Orthodox press that had already had 20 years of success marrying a gift for aesthetics with translated orthodoxy, began to publish its own translation of the Talmud. Keyed into the ultra-Orthodox world and well familiar with the Steinsaltz politics, the Art Scroll folks resolved the tension over the Symbolics in a curious way. Art Scroll produced its own vocalization and English translation of the Talmud. Here, it's vocalized and translated, coupled with selected nuggets from translations of lots of commentary. The enhanced Talmud over a millennium is down here. Instead of repaginating the Talmud, Art Scroll published its translation in a facing page edition, where the translation always faces the traditional Vilna page it translates. Now, Art Scroll was not the first to come up with this idea. The Sonsino Talmud, a British translation of the Talmud into English, had produced a facing page edition in the early 70s. The problem with this edition, and the problem facing Art Scroll editors, was that the Talmud is so complex and its language so dense that it is a major challenge to fit the English on a facing page. The Sonsino edition solved this problem by having each translation page inelegantly continue somewhere in the back of the book. It's kind of like if you ever read the New York Times Magazine and the articles continue at the back and you're always looking, where does it continue? That's what they did with Sonsino, a solution that makes this edition pretty hard to use. Art Scroll came up with their own solution. Instead of trying to fit the translation to a single page, they reproduced the Vilna page as many times as it is necessary for the translation side. Now, this is also, by the way, everything I'm going to say from now on is going to show how once Vilna becomes the default body, a lot of these practices are reifying and emphasizing that it's the body over and over again. Each Vilna page then gets reproduced between 3 and 6. I've even seen some places where it's reproduced 8 times, so that the reader is always able to read the English opposite the Vilna page it translates. This environmentally disastrous solution, which unnecessarily reprints the same page multiple times, turned out to be genius. It's genius. The Art Scroll edition has created a market for translated Talmud that has never been seen before. Some of its volumes have sold upwards of 1 million copies. Now, my book is selling well, but it's never going to get close to 1 million. 1 million copies is really something. And other people have noticed the success of Art Scroll has inspired imitation. The new Steinsaltz translations in both Hebrew and English now incorporate the Vilna image. An academic commentary series produced by the Society for the Interpretation of the Talmud incorporates the policy of reprinting the facing Vilna page repeatedly. Even the Bar Ilan Responsa Project database, the earliest and best electronic text database, which offers all of its books exclusively in digital text format, has one exception. When you work on the Talmud, you can choose to see digital text or the image of the Vilna page. Now, before I offer some analysis, oh, by the way, I need to say one aside, though. This is an image from the earliest edition of the Art Scroll Talmud. Art Scroll has secretly been replacing its Vilna side with some updates. They've replaced, this is actually a photo offset of the 1880s Vilna on that side, but now they're using laser print imitations of Vilna, which add additional features and make the text a little crisper. So they've managed, now that they've got market saturation and penetration, and they're not going to be sold down the river by their fellow ultra-Orthodox, they're now kind of experimenting with the page, which is interesting to see where this goes, whether they actually do something original down the road. Before I offer some analysis of the symbolic rise of the Vilna Talmud in contemporary Jewish life, I need to highlight some other changes to the Talmud's function as a religious text in today's Judaism. In 2012, 600,000 people packed stadiums and arenas around the world to celebrate the end of a Daf Yomi cycle. Daf Yomi is a program through which participants study one double-sided page of Talmud every day. It takes about 7.5 years for people to finish the Talmud this way. Now, Daf Yomi, when it was originally founded, was an obscure phenomenon that interested a small cadre of elite scholars. People who did it were either former or current yeshiva students with tremendous reading fluency in the text. Today, Daf Yomi has become universalized as a lay learning project. This is completely new. In the United States, nearly every metropolitan Orthodox synagogue, I don't know about Palo Alto, I didn't check, that offers daily prayer services. If you offer daily prayer services, you also offer Daf Yomi classes. There are Daf Yomi classes on the Long Island Railroad and on the internet. There has been tremendous symbiosis in the relationship between Daf Yomi and the ArtScroll Talmud. The reason why the ArtScroll Talmud is selling 1 million copies is because people are doing Daf Yomi. For those of you who have not studied the Talmud, let me note that the Talmud is hard, and that the pace of 2 sides of Talmud a day is difficult, if not impossible, for many, if not most, of the participants in Daf Yomi. It just is. So when we evaluate Daf Yomi as a phenomenon, we need to be a little suspicious of it on purely intellectual or educational grounds. Like many religious communal activities, Daf Yomi has significant social value. It creates a daily bonding exercise for its participants who are fellow travelers on the 7.5-year journey. In some places, Daf Yomi classes are a cross between educational exercises and ritual activity. So I know of some Daf Yomi lectures with the reputation of finishing the Daf in 30 minutes or less. These lectures amount to something akin to a ritual recitation of the text. It's kind of like what Jews have done for a long time with Psalms, where they just read it without translating it and without comprehending it. Now, Jews have seen this movie before. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, were originally read to the public in the Second Temple as an educational program. When Ezra comes back from Babylonia in the 5th century BCE, and he teaches the people all about the Judaism that they no longer remember, he uses the Torah scroll as his educational tool. Even in the rabbinic period, there was simultaneous translation of Torah reading to make the Torah's content digestible to the synagogue crowd. Today, though, Torah reading is at least 99% ritual and 1% educational. In many places in the world, the congregation does not understand the language of the Torah. And in those places in which they do, in Israel, for example, they often do not attend to the meaning of the text, which is being recited musically and often quite quickly. The Talmud in modernity, and that's not to mention what happens in Reform synagogues where they're reading on a triennial cycle and they're not even continuing from one week to the next, the content, right? So how do you tell a story and you're reading the second third in that year, right? It only works because it's a ritual text that doesn't need to continue. The Talmud in modernity is currently undergoing a process of ritualization through Daf Yomi. Further evidence of this comes in the form of weekly study sheets for children called Daf Yomi for Kids that are now distributed in Israel alongside ubiquitous examples of such sheets that relate to the weekly Torah portion. So if you go into a synagogue in Israel, you are bombarded with paper, leaflets produced by every organization that are essentially little homilies, sermons, divrei Torah, words of Torah, that people have made on the Torah portion. But over the last 20 years, there has now increasingly been a market of people producing Daf Yomi sheets, study aids for people who do Daf Yomi, giving them a little extra pepper on their Daf Yomi. But a few years ago, they started doing Daf Yomi for kids. Now, like the Torah reading, Daf Yomi has become a communal calendar. Just as the Jewish community collectively reenacts the Bible and its narrative through Torah reading, it enacts the Talmud through Daf Yomi. The children's Daf Yomi sheets make it possible for a child to keep up with a parent's Daf Yomi studies by knowing that this week, for example, issues of divorce law were covered. Why a child would need to know that, I don't know. But why does a child need to know the sacrificial rites of Leviticus, right? But it's taught because that's the Torah portion. Now, just last week, this is fresh news, I learned of a new ritualization. My brother, who lives in Israel, participated in an event, I think it was actually called Hacking the Talmud, okay? It was a hack, in which a group of men completed the entire Talmud in a single day by dividing the corpus into separate parts. Such an event hardly represents a major intellectual or educational moment. I feel bad for the attendees who had to study several consecutive and random pages of the harder tractates like Eruvin about fictional walls. Professor von Robert has been working on a book about Eruvin, which is one of the harder tractates in the Talmud. Yevamot, about levirate marriage, with all of the crazy family relationships that come up in that tract. Or Nidarim, about the languages of vows. This stuff is very complicated. Imagine being told your assignment is 12 random pages in the middle of Nidarim. This event is clearly a ritualization that takes advantage of the Talmud's reputation for being voluminous and difficult to give the participants a feeling of accomplishment for the group act of completion. And I have to say I have a personal relationship to this kind of thing. I was once coming back from yeshiva in Israel, and I noticed that there were like 20 guys from my yeshiva coming back. So I arranged that we should review and finish collectively the tractate that we had been studying in yeshiva on the flight. So I feel like I invented this ritualization. This is something that I came up with 20 years ago. So let me now return, though, to discuss the Talmud's fixed physical form, the Vilna edition. It's fair to point out, as I did earlier, that the Ram edition was already quite popular in the 19th century for strong substantive reasons: the quality of the paper, new commentaries, the luxury reputation. It's also good to remember that the timing of photo offset technology and World War I also cemented this dominance. Even with these factors, I'd like to offer some deeper analysis of the rise of the Vilna image and its religious role today. One of the most important distinctions that religion scholars make is the distinction between traditional and traditionalist practices. The emancipation of the Jews in modernity created individual autonomy that had not previously existed. Where a 15th century Jew had no choice but to live within a religious community and at least formally abide by its traditional structures and practices, at least make the appearance of doing so, Jews in modernity have a choice even within the most deeply traditional communities. This fundamentally important fact leads to traditionalism, which is an attempt to assert tradition in the face of modernity. Daf Yomi is a traditionalist ritual that affords the autonomous modern Jew the opportunity to engage a traditionally significant text. It is a decidedly modern phenomenon because even at the height of the Talmud's import in 19th century Eastern Europe, only a very small percentage of the male Jewish population would have been able to do it, maybe 3%. When Daf Yomi was first initiated in the early 20th century, only the yeshiva educated could do it. Today's universal education practices and the printing of translations like Art Scrolls have enabled the modern production of a traditionalist ritual. The distinction between traditional and traditionalist has something to say about religious performance. Irving Goffman famously developed the idea of personal identity in general as performance. Someone living in a traditional Jewish community in the 15th century would thus have been engaged in Goffman's sense in religious performances as well. But we can distinguish between traditional and traditionalist practices by noting that traditionalist practices are often out of step with the performances of a larger culture and thus more visible. Traditionalism masks change in the face of changing reality. So think about the ultra-Orthodox decision to cover women's hair or for men to wear black frocks and hats, including some fur-lined ones. So these practices were not that out of step in cold Eastern Europe. But when someone's wearing a strimal on an 80-degree day in Palo Alto, the religious performance as a performance becomes that much more visible. One thing that develops under these conditions is that the integrity of the performance becomes that much more important for the practitioner who understands the behavior as a performance. So to do Daf Yomi, one has to be able to see oneself as a traditional learner, and a traditional learner learns from a Vilna Shas. Together with religious traditionalism, there is a strong role that nostalgia plays in the current fetishization of the image of the Talmud. In this post-Holocaust Jewish world, there is considerable nostalgia for the vanished world of Eastern Europe. Think about Roman Vishniac's pictures and the way they distort the real Eastern European in favor of a fetishized Eastern European world. Much of this nostalgia overwhelms the historical realities of Eastern Europe before World War II and projects an imagined universal Shtetl life in which the Talmud, visualized as the Vilna edition, played an unchallenged role. The Vilna provenance of the Ram edition makes it easier to think of the Talmud as a time machine, allowing the learner to use its portal to travel to the yeshivas of Slovakia or Volozhin. Finally, let me return to the Art Scroll Talmud and note the brilliance of its facing page apparatus. The Art Scroll Talmud's English translation is very easy to understand. In fact, I'd argue that it's too easy. The Talmud is hard, even for specialists, which is why it makes little sense as a lay text. It's never made sense as a lay text. Art Scroll has fixed this problem by making it easy. Of course, in order to do this, it has incorporated commentary into the translation and eliminated some of the things that make the essential Talmud so interesting to academics like Professor von Robert and myself, and also help explain where the enhanced Talmud comes from. The enhanced Talmud is the struggle to make sense of this very difficult text. The problem with simplicity is that it undermines gravitas. If the Talmud is easily understood, how is the learner to comprehend its depth, and why the special skill of studying this text has long granted certain figures, rabbis, communal authority? The facing Vilna page is an effective way of perpetually reminding the reader that the Talmud is actually hard, but is being made easy for them. There have recently been so I'm going to move on now. There have recently been some outstanding works of art that employ the Vilna page image of the Talmud. So my book features one of them on the cover. This is an artwork by a contemporary artist in Israel. She's originally from Kansas City. Her name is Andi Arnovitz. And the artwork is called If They Only Asked Us. It is a feminist critique of the Talmud, in which she printed out the Talmud on these little colored pieces of Japanese paper, and she sewed it together into a garment that looks like Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat. If you look at the binding of my book, the publishers, they were so nice to me. They didn't tell me they were doing this. They used the detail of the book for the cover, but they put the full picture of the garment on the binding so you can actually see it. It's a beautiful piece of art. And what enables it is the fact that you have the Vilna Shas, which is instantly identifiable. Its fonts, anyone who's studied it knows and recognizes what this page looks like. So she printed out Vilna edition and sewed it together. If you look at it up close, you can see it's Vilna edition. So the fact that the Talmud is an icon with a physical body now allows for certain kinds of art. I might have used this art as the cover of my book because I really like this one as well. But it was already used by a different academic book called Jews and Shoes, which was an edited volume that came out of a conference. There was a conference session at AJS a few years ago with the title Jews and Shoes. And so it's random essays about Jews and shoes throughout history. And they use this artwork. So this is a work by Nechama Golan, another Israeli contemporary artist, called You Shall Walk in Good Ways. So suffice it to say that this artwork is a feminist critique of tradition that employs the Vilna image of the Talmud as the default image of tradition. By now, this move at the end of my talk should not come as a surprise. What I have attempted to show is that for hundreds of years, the Talmud has functioned as a Jewish symbol, and some of its meaning has taken place within this symbolic register. What has happened uniquely in modernity is that the Talmud has acquired a formal body, a symbolic representation that allows the Talmud to work as an icon and has prompted new religious practices and modes of engagement. This iconic status is only beginning to be tapped into in the world of contemporary art. By the way, I have my own ideas of artworks that could be made taking advantage of this insight. So I have plans of making artwork at some point. I'm gonna send out flyers when I finally make it. I have a whole idea. Now, Golan's shoe is the Talmud as Cinderella's slipper. The passage that appears on the shoe is one in which a woman, ha'isha, is the grammatical subject of the sentence, but the legal object. The framed word ha'isha, and that framing is unique to Vilna, meaning the woman celebrates this grammatical subject, or at least it seems to, but the content of the sentence, how a woman is acquired, using the language of acquisition in marriage, denigrates her. The Talmud on the shoe is made aesthetic and sexualized. The shoe forces the viewer to think about female fashion and the male gaze, about female sexual agency as a passive-aggressive, come-hither invitation to male sexual control. By marrying the Talmud produced and consumed historically by men with the female shoe, Golan introduces gender expectations and the relationship between gender and tradition into the conversation. This is yet another way in which the Talmud's realization of an iconic form has created new religious opportunities in modernity. While the existence of a symbolic register is not new, I hope that I've demonstrated that the Talmud's highly visual symbolics are a recent and rapidly changing contemporary phenomenon. So now to close and return to Alice Walker. The content of Walker's poem highlights a few scattered passages in the Talmud that are antisocial, passages that talk about non-Jews not being on the same level as Jews in a variety of ways. And they're the same materials that have been highlighted to make the same point since the 13th century. As Jews, I think it is important to own these problematic texts as problematic. and to own them as our own, they are ours, to contextualize them by pointing out that they comprise a tiny fraction of the vast corpus of the Talmud. They make up less than 0.1% of the words of the Talmud, and to apologize for them, as Jews have been doing regularly since the dawn of modernity in the 18th century. From what I've said so far, it should be clear that Walker's Talmud is not the essential Talmud studied by myself or other academics like Professor von Robert. It's not the enhanced Talmud studied by rabbis and yeshiva students of all stripes. It is a political Talmud, an emblematic one, used as the object of a tug of war for centuries. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
So, am I right that much, if not most, if not all, of the Talmud is the details of how to do things which really can only be done in a ritually proper way while the temple is standing? Well,
that is not correct. There are sections of the Talmud. So the question is, are the details of the Talmud describing rituals that cannot be properly performed in the absence of a temple? And I have to correct that, because the Talmud was produced in a world in which there was no temple by people who were engaged in the process of figuring out how to move beyond the temple. And so the surprising feature is that there are materials in the Talmud that are interested in how the temple works and do detail how the rites happen, but that's not the majority of the text. A lot of the Talmud is still possible and practical. And there's a difference also here between the Babylonian Talmud, which I've been talking about today, and the Palestinian Talmud. So the Palestinian Talmud has, for example, many more tractates about agricultural laws than the Babylonian Talmud, and it kind of makes sense because in the land of Israel, the agricultural laws apply, and they would have applied even absent a temple, and so there was more interest in that. Whereas in the Babylonian Talmud, there's more stuff about temple practices. Actually, there's more tractates about the temple rites, which doesn't really make much sense, but it is a fact that the Babylonian Talmud has a lot of stuff about how the temple was run. Yeah. Yes?
I have a naive question. These different editions, do they represent a group of people discussing something and agreeing on the text and the wording of it? Or is there a single author who listens to the discussion and writes?
So I'm not sure. So the question was, do these editions reflect groupthink of a group of people getting together and deciding what the text should be, or is there a single person who's... and I think I have to distinguish between the original Talmud itself and the later editions of the Talmud, because I'm not sure your question could be addressed to both of them. So originally, Talmud in the rabbinic period was a study practice where rabbis gathered together. They organized themselves around the Mishnah, a work of Jewish law that was produced around the year 200 and was itself based on earlier rabbinic conversations. They gathered around the Mishnah and they unpacked what the Mishnah was about in collective conversations. These conversations transpired over several generations. And at some point, they were gathered together or edited in such a way that they read more coherently. And this is actually one of the big differences between the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud had more of an active editing than the Palestinian Talmud did, which is why it's much more readable than the Palestinian Talmud. So there is some editing involved. We don't know who the editors of the Babylonian Talmud were. We think of them generally in the plural as a collective of editors, but it could have been a single person. We don't know. Later on, if you're talking about print editions, so the way print editions worked was they just copied the text from the previous print edition, and it was usually just one person who was the printer who was laying out the text. And actually, in the age of print, there's not much variance between different editions of the Talmud because they're just pretty much copying the text of the previous edition and keeping it pretty much constant. Actually, one of the things that's different about the Vilna edition is, in an effort to add a new feature, Vilna adds, if you've ever studied Vilna, you may know that occasionally there are parentheses and brackets around words. That is the Vilna's attempt to take into account not the manuscripts of the Talmud themselves, but various 17th century works of scholarship in which the scholars tried to modify the text in light of those manuscripts and other ideas from their own head. And so the Vilna tried to incorporate that into the text, which is why you have parentheses, which means you shouldn't read this text, and brackets, which mean you should read this text because it's being corrected on the basis of 17th century sources. Yeah.
So, first of all, I'm wowed. I almost can't formulate this question, but I recently became aware of the history of the Volozhin Yeshiva, which was like the creme de la creme.
Yes.
And that what happened in the late 19th and 20th century with Israel and after the Shoah, that this idea of sending elite young men to yeshivot, and therefore in the state of Israel, the Haredi communities had maybe 800 people in 1948 that were exempt from the army, now has turned into
70,000 right now.
Right, okay, so, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in the Knesset about that. So that the yeshiva world became just blown up, and it just reminded me of what you were saying about going from Vilna to Art Scroll, and it almost sounds like, especially with once you get to the kids' Daf Yomi, that we're going, it's a similar movement from the priesthood to rabbinics to the popular, I'm thinking like Yitz Greenberg's philosophy of the people, or somehow the democratization of, is that a fair saying that the Vilna Shas and then Art Scroll, is that a fair conclusion or
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to think of this as a popularization. It's also, it's kind of similar to it's like a Protestantization of Judaism, where in the Protestant Reformation, you're giving people access to a text that was considered, only the priests were reading the actual Bible. But now you're inviting the congregation to have a Bible in front of them. That was one of the things that the Protestants, sola scriptura, going back to the text. So there's definitely a piece of this in this revolution that's happening with Talmud, where you're giving people access. It's a little strange because the thing you're giving them access to is not something that is obviously meaningful to individuals on a regular basis. A lot of the Talmud is like obscure purities laws. I mean, and some people write really wonderful books about menstrual purity, but it's kind of a surprising subject for people to be really spending a lot of time on, and doing daily practice of. It's hardly like mindfulness or something that you kind of really see the stakes and the health payoffs of. Like it's something that's kind of strange, but I think you're right to relate what's going on in what I'm describing in Daf Yomi to what's going on and also in the Haredi. What's happening in the Haredi world is the norms of universal education have hit the Haredi world, and so it was once that everybody in 19th century Eastern Europe, everybody had cheder education, which was basically, they knew how to read some basic Bible. If there was someone who was special, then the community might send them to, but it also depended on the family's wealth. It depended on a lot of factors, whether someone would go off to a Volozhin. There weren't that many such yeshivas, and the expectations were that people who went to those yeshivas would be doing this for life, and they would be marrying someone wealthy enough to support them. These were the Sheina Leute, the beautiful people, the wealthy, and those who were brilliant Talmud scholars. It was a very small percentage of the population. What's happened now in the ultra-Orthodox Haredi world, particularly in Israel, is that this has become completely universalized. The expectation is that 90% of the population is supposed to sit and study Talmud for 15, 20 years. And it comes at the cost of being trained in various things. So there's a lot of ramifications, but it's similarly related to what's going on in terms of Daf Yomi. And I would also point out, I've had conversations with Moshe Halbertal about this. What's fascinating is that despite the fact that more people are studying Talmud in Haredi institutions now than ever before, there's not a lot rising to the top. There aren't new publications of like groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting works on the Talmud. There's nothing coming out. There's no intellectual productivity. And I interviewed for another project I'm working on, I interviewed a guy who's been studying in a kollel in Jerusalem and has been in Israeli yeshivas for 15 years. And I asked him about this, and he said, yes, because yeshivas have gotten out of the business of producing ideas, and they're now in the business of producing ultra-Orthodox people. Right? So there's interesting things happening, and I think that's also part of what's happening with Daf Yomi is you allow people to understand that their yeshiva experience continues into the rest of their lives. So it doesn't end when they graduate school. They get to continue to feel as though they are yeshiva students by studying Daf Yomi in this way. So there's a lot of really interesting, yeah. Oh, yes, please.
You mentioned a little bit about, you talked a little bit about the Talmud as a symbol outside of the Jewish community. And I wonder if you know or can tell us a little bit more about that. So there are places in which the Talmud, for example, is taken to be what makes the Jews smart, for example, or a symbol for the Jewish learning, or things like that. I'm thinking about Korea, for example.
So in the book, I talk about Korea in the book. Korea was actually one of the things that really got me thinking about the emblematic Talmud. And the reason why I was able to put it together with a disputation was because I realized that I had the same feeling when I was in Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's class in college, and he was talking about the disputation, and he was talking about the Talmud, and I didn't recognize what he was talking about. I didn't know, what are you talking? That's not the Talmud. I study the Talmud all day, and I don't recognize this document that you're talking about. The Korean Talmud, for those of you who don't know, the Talmud is popular in Korea. What this means is that many books have been published over the last 40 years with the word Talmud in the title. And the content of these books varies significantly, but in general I can say about it that the content is mostly aphorisms, like proverbs that are either from the Talmud or from other parts of the Jewish tradition, or stories, some of which originate in the Talmud or other works of rabbinic literature, and some of which are from 20th century storytellers, Hasidic literature, or even the life stories of the rabbi who was out in Japan and whose life story got transcribed and became the basis for the Japanese Talmud, which became the basis for the Korean Talmud. The Korean Talmuds that are produced now are so overtly about the symbolic stakes. The recent one that really sticks out to me is the one that's called Talmud Secrets of Jewish Business Success, and has a picture of Mark Zuckerberg on the cover. So it's this kind of bizarre thing where, like, it's this moment where philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism kind of meet. They admire Jews who they don't really know for their outsized success in intellectual and business areas. So the Koreans will know that Jews have won a lot of Nobel Prizes and have been very successfully economically despite their demographic size. And so because of that, they're interested in the Talmud, but the Talmuds that they're studying are not actually our Talmud. They're like something else that they've called the Talmud. But I don't want to dismiss this phenomenon as not worth talking about. It is worth talking about, and what's interesting now, so on Facebook last week I saw that a Korean delegation was at Yeshivat Har Etzion in the occupied territories studying Talmud with the rabbis there. So like that's happening. I heard of another thing that was happening last week related to this. Right, so there may be, and I have this online course, this massive open online course, MOOC, on the Talmud. I think it's the only one out there in the MOOC platforms. And when I tweeted about it, I used Google Translate to tweet about it in Korean, and my numbers jumped overnight. Because there is an audience out there that's interested in the Talmud. Oh, so what I saw is I saw a recent article last week that what they've now become interested in is not the content of the Talmud, but the form in which the Talmud is studied, chavruta study. So now what you have is in Korean schools, they're studying their own stuff in chavruta because they've now decided that that's the model of Jewish success, is that type of study. Some of these Korean Talmuds are overtly Christian books. So you'll see like passages of Talmud alongside like pictures of rosary beads and crosses. It's some of the most bizarre stuff you'll ever see, and there's a scholar at Fordham, Sarit Katan Gribbets, who just published an article last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago in the AJS Review that's all about the Korean Talmuds, and she went to Korea with a student who speaks Korean so that they could do a more scholarly investigation of what's going on there. I haven't finished the article yet, but I was on a panel with Sarit a couple of years ago, and she said, I think we should think about the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud and the Korean Talmud. Like it's a different animal, but it's one that academics should take some interest in it. It's an interesting phenomenon. So I take interest in it but I can't elevate it to the level of the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud because the content of that material is so important to me. I have to take it seriously as a cultural phenomenon, so I put it in my emblematic category. But I think there's a lot of stuff going on in this emblematic category. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that in terms of modern factions of Judaism, and this might, in terms of you talked about in terms of outside, I spent a lot of time talking about outsiders' reactions. In terms of modern factions of Judaism, there's a repeating narrative, there's a recurring narrative about what happens with modern factions and the Talmud. So a modern faction will try to constitute itself, and typically a modern faction will view the Talmud as the embodiment of tradition. So that's the emblematic Talmud at work. So whether you're talking about Reform Judaism or Hasidism, whether you're talking about Zionism or American feminism, whatever movement you're talking about, they typically identify the Talmud as this sort of stodgy symbol of traditionalism or tradition, and they push away from it, and they identify themselves as we are not that, we don't want anything to do with that. So the first generation will make this move of saying no Talmud for us. And then, once the faction is established, a later generation comes back and reclaims the Talmud because the Talmud is so rich and lends itself to reinterpretation because it has all these layers and differences of opinion and you can do lots of things with it. So I live in Chicago. In Chicago there is an institution called Svara, which is a queer yeshiva dedicated to queering the Talmud and bringing out LBGT features of the Talmud. It builds on Dano Boyarin's work on heroic conduct, where he started to queer the Talmud in interesting ways. Right? So this is fascinating. And what I think is, like, if you think about sort of the emblematic versus the essential enhanced, that first move is really an emblematic move. They don't want to have anything to do with the Talmud. The Talmud is the symbol. We push it away. But then once they're established, they come back to the content and they want to make it their own. And so they become participants in the essential or enhanced discourse around the Talmud. And that's why you have something like the feminist commentary to the Talmud, which I think you have a volume in, right? Well, maybe one day. So there's this academic feminist commentary of the Talmud edited by Tali Lan, and individual scholars are committing to write individual tractates, and some of them are already out. Right, so what does this mean? That, in the same way you have protest art that's saying the Talmud is all male and we should call it that, and Yentl came out and said, we deserve a place, and now, like, there's a feminist commentary to the Talmud. So there's a re-engagement with the content. So I think that, like, there's interesting things going on if we think about the Talmud in these different registers.
Maybe I missed it, but the development between when it was oral and written.
Yeah.
So until it was written, it was, they discussed and they changed stuff, I guess, I don't know. Now, it's the same written thing from the 7th century, and it's the same words pretty much, or there was the changes in the Talmud itself?
I love this question, which is about, there was an oral period and maybe the Talmud was more fluid in the oral period, and then when it starts getting handwritten, does it change? Yeah. Is it the same text? And I can tell you the shocking thing. The shocking thing is that it is remarkably, our text that we have in our printed editions is so similar to what they had in the 9th century, it would shock you. So even though, if you look at all the manuscripts and all the commentaries and you collect all of the different variations, there was a scholar in the 19th century, Rafal Nassan Nata Rabinovich, who was an Eastern European Jew who travels to Munich and dedicates his whole life to collecting all of the variants of the Talmud and putting them together in an edition called Dikduke Sofrim, which was the first critical edition of the Talmud. If you study the Talmud carefully and you attend to it, the variants make a difference. Occasionally there's an important variance that will change the meaning of a text. But it's probably, if you did a statistical analysis, it would be less than 5% of the text is different in all of the different variations. Now, you ask the question, in the oral period, was it also different? So in the oral period, the rabbis had special people among them who were noted for their memories, who were given the task of memorizing and repeating. So did they occasionally make mistakes? For sure. Did things change? Probably. But probably not much more than they changed once it became a handwritten thing. And one of the things that one of my teachers, Shama Friedman, has demonstrated in very extensive studies of this is that despite the seemingly important transition from the oral stage to the written stage, some of the things that we associate with writing, some of the like interpretive moves that we would imagine would only be possible on a written text, we can show they were doing on oral text. So there's really not much difference between the way they studied it when it was oral and the way they study it now, though now with digital text we have the advantages of being able to do amazing searches, and we can check the text for all kinds of things, and we're discovering constantly new things because we have these new tools. But in terms of like just the basic text itself, there hasn't been as much variety as you would expect.
Maybe one more question.
One more question.
Sorry, take the last one.
Say so when you assistant.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask a question that might be really hard and that I suspect you're not going to like. So I'll preface it with that.
Wow.
So
okay.
I feel like there's kind of lurking judgment about kind of how people are engaging with Talmud. And I'm specifically interested in the fact that you kind of coded the mystification of the Talmud as a Catholic move, right? Like as being akin to the Eucharist and the reproduction of certain texts in like certain fonts as a kind of Eucharistic quality of fetishization, idol worship, that sense of a kind of corporal identity. And then on the other hand, you kind of offered a more Protestant reading of the way in which these things, as you said, are democratized, are made accessible, are demystified. I guess I'm wondering what you understand to be the Jewish way of engaging with the Talmud, if both of those are coded Christian.
Oh, very good question. So the question is, and I take the question to be like manifold, right? I mean, you're asking about the sort of clash within what I was saying between a certain judgment that seems to be valorizing the Protestantization and at the same time valorizing the Catholicization of it. And at the same time, because I'm using this terminology from Christianity, like, is there an inherently Jewish way of doing these things? So, and you mentioned the word judgment, and what I'll say is, and this is this is nice because it allows me to go back to something that I open with. I, in my experience studying the Talmud in an advanced way, have changed a lot as a person. In my youth, I was very passionate about the Talmud, and I understood my method of studying the Talmud to be the single and sole and unique way of doing things. And this kind of critical historical method, which is what academics primarily do. And I spent, in my previous lifetime when I was in rabbinical school, I spent 4 years fighting tooth and nail with critics of mine who were doing things like censoring my writings or preventing me from accessing certain things. I was so passionate about what I felt was the right way of doing things, and the right way was like a modern scientific way of approaching this material. And fortunately, I didn't write this book at the time. Fortunately, I've written this book many years afterwards when I've gotten some distance from the passion of my youth. And what I'm trying deliberately to do in the book is I'm trying to deliberately to create space for different models of thinking about the text. So my presentation today may have been a little more judgy than what I do in the book. What I'm trying to do with these different registers is to recognize that even though in Chaim Potak's novel, The Promise, there's this big tension between academic readers and traditional readers, and the same tension that I felt when I was in yeshiva reading like an academic. But actually, they don't have to be in tension because they're not doing the same thing. And you can create space for everyone to do their own thing with this material. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is to create as much space as possible. So I talk about how in modernity, the Talmud comes to be something that Christian academics are interested in, and so it's taught in seminaries. This is one of the legacies of Jacob Neusner, of the sort of opening of the Talmud in the academy. And I talk about how the Talmud becomes the basis for Jewish comedy in interesting ways, and is like explicitly invoked by the creators of Seinfeld. I mean, so the Talmud, and Emmanuel Levinas takes the Talmud and turns it into French critical 1960s theory. The Talmud is opened up in all of these really fascinating ways. And what I try to do in the book, at least, is to create space. And now you're putting me on the spot and saying, okay, you've created all this space. Is there like a specific Jewish... And here I probably have to go back to like who I am. I still believe that my way of studying the Talmud is the best way of studying the Talmud. I like to access what the rabbis were trying to do in late antiquity. But to recognize that because we are modern readers and we don't accept the possibility that you can ever accurately and 100% recover the original meaning of the text for a variety of reasons having to do with hermeneutics. I'd like to use whatever tools are possible for us and to recognize our own subjectivities to, as much as possible, recreate the original meaning of this text, but also recognize that that meaning is going to be filtered through the lenses that we're using nowadays. So that's the reading that I would advocate for, and I feel like I still try to embody in my own work. So I hope that answered your question, but it was a hard one. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe there's still time for individual questions, because we also have the bookstore here to offer the books for sale.
I'd be happy to sign books too if you'd like that.
And and with that, thank you so much, Barry. This was wonderful.
Thank you.